Before we begin this epic tale, please take a moment to like this video. If you enjoy Viking stories, subscribe to our channel for more legendary tales, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support helps us bring you more amazing stories from the age of the Vikings. The morning mist clung to the rocky shores of the northern fjord like the breath of sleeping giants. Olaf Stormborn stood at the helm of his longship Sea Raven, his weathered hands gripping the carved dragon head that adorned the bow. The vessel cut through the dark waters with the grace of a hunting wolf, its crimson and gold sail billowing in the crisp autumn wind. Olaf was not a young man anymore. 40 winters had passed since his first raid, and his auburn beard now bore streaks of silver, like frost on autumn leaves. His blue eyes, sharp as winter ice, scanned the coastline ahead. This was meant to be a peaceful trading voyage to the southern settlements, carrying amber, furs, and iron tools to exchange for grain and silver. But peace, Olaf had learned, was as fleeting as summer in the Northlands. The cry reached them first, as a whisper on the wind, so faint that even Gunther, his most experienced helmsman, turned his grizzled head to listen. Then it came again, clearer now, a woman's voice, desperate and broken, calling across the water like a wounded seabird. "Captain," called Leif, the youngest of his crew, pointing toward a small cove nestled between towering cliffs. "There, smoke rises from beyond those rocks." Olaf squinted against the morning sun. Indeed, thin columns of black smoke spiraled upward, too thick and dark to be from cooking fires. His stomach tightened with the familiar weight of approaching danger. "Bring us closer," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of countless voyages. "But ready the shields. Something isn't right." As the Sea Raven rounded the rocky outcropping, the scene that unfolded before them made even these seasoned warriors draw sharp breaths. A small fishing village lay in ruins, its modest wooden houses reduced to smouldering frames. Fishing nets hung torn and abandoned from their drying racks, and overturned boats dotted the pebbly shore like the shells of dead crabs. But it was the figures moving among the destruction that made Olaf's blood run cold. Raiders, but not Vikings. These men wore different armor, carried unfamiliar weapons, and moved with the organized precision of a foreign army. Their shields bore symbols Olaf didn't recognize, painted in colors that seemed to swallow the morning light. "By Odin's eye," whispered Gunther, crossing himself with the hammer of Thor that hung from his neck. "Who are these men?" Before Olaf could answer, the woman's cry came again, more desperate now. Among the ruins of what had once been the village center, they spotted her, a young mother with hair the color of summer wheat, clutching a small child to her breast. She knelt beside the body of a man who could only have been her husband, her voice breaking as she called out to the gods for mercy. 3 of the foreign warriors advanced toward her, their intentions clear in their predatory movements. The woman looked up, her eyes wild with grief and terror, and her voice carried across the water with supernatural clarity. "Please, someone, anyone, save my child." The words hit Olaf like a physical blow. In them he heard echoes of his own wife's voice from decades past, when raiders had come to his village and he had been too far at sea to protect her. He had failed then. He would not fail now. "Drop anchor," he commanded, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions within him. "Gunther, take 5 men and circle around behind those cliffs. The rest of you with me." "Captain," Leif ventured, his young face pale with concern, "there are too many of them, and we don't even know who they are or why they're here." Olaf turned to face his crew, and in that moment they saw not just their captain but the legendary warrior who had earned his name by calling down lightning itself in the heat of battle. His eyes blazed with an inner fire that seemed to reflect the storm clouds gathering overhead. "I know who they are," he said, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "They are those who would harm the innocent. They are those who would steal children from their mothers' arms. And I know who we are. We are the sons of Odin, the chosen of Thor, and we do not stand by while evil flourishes." The crew exchanged glances, and as one, they nodded their agreement. These were men who had sailed with Olaf through storms that would have broken lesser vessels, who had seen him navigate by the stars when the sun disappeared for months at a time, who had watched him trade with kings and jarls as equals. If their captain said they would fight, then fight they would. As they prepared to make landfall, the storm clouds that had been gathering all morning suddenly darkened, and the first rumble of thunder echoed across the fjord. Olaf looked up at the sky and felt the familiar stirring in his blood, the same feeling he had experienced before every great battle, every moment when the gods themselves seemed to be watching. They beached the Sea Raven in a small cove just out of sight of the raiders, the keel grinding against the stones with a sound like grinding teeth. Olaf was the first to leap into the shallow water, his battle-axe gleaming in his hand like captured starlight. Behind him came his warriors, 12 good men who had followed him across the Whale Road and would follow him into the halls of Valhalla itself if necessary. The approach to the village was treacherous, requiring them to climb over sharp rocks and navigate through dense patches of thorny undergrowth. But Olaf moved with the sure-footed grace of a mountain goat, his years of exploration serving him well. Behind him, his men followed in silent single file, their weapons ready, but their footsteps careful not to alert their enemies. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the village, Olaf could see the scene more clearly. The foreign raiders numbered at least 20, all armed and armored in the fashion of southern lands. They moved through the village with systematic efficiency, gathering anything of value and preparing to load it into their own ships, which were anchored just beyond the village's small harbour. But his attention was drawn inexorably to the woman and child at the village's heart. The mother had stopped crying out and now held her son close, rocking back and forth as she whispered what sounded like prayers or lullabies. The boy couldn't have been more than 5 winters old, his small face buried against his mother's shoulder. The 3 raiders approaching them had slowed their advance, seeming to savor the terror they were causing. Olaf could see the cruel enjoyment in their postures, the way they gestured to each other and laughed at the woman's despair. Something deep within Olaf's chest began to burn, not with anger, though anger was certainly there, but with something far more ancient and powerful. It was the same feeling he had experienced in his youth when he had first felt the god's presence, when he had realized that some mortals were chosen to serve as instruments of divine will. He raised his battle-axe high above his head, feeling the weight of it like an extension of his own arm. The weapon had been forged by the legendary smith Wayland himself, its steel folded 7 times and quenched in the blood of a sea serpent. Its handle was carved from the wood of Yggdrasil, the world tree, and bound with silver wire that had been blessed by the high priests of Uppsala. "Thor," he whispered, his voice carrying across the morning air with surprising clarity. "Thunderer, son of Odin, protector of Midgard, I call upon you now. These innocent ones have no champion but me, and I am but one man against many. If ever you have heard the prayers of your faithful servant, hear them now." The wind suddenly stilled, as if the entire world were holding its breath. The storm clouds overhead darkened further, and the air itself seemed to thicken with electric potential. Olaf felt the familiar tingling in his limbs that always preceded Thor's response to his prayers. But this time, it was stronger than ever before, as if the god himself were drawing closer to the mortal realm. "Grant me your strength," Olaf continued, his voice growing more confident with each word. "Grant me your speed, grant me your fury. Let these enemies know that Thor Thunderer protects the innocent, and that his hammer strikes down those who would harm children." The first lightning bolt split the sky at that moment, a brilliant white-blue flash that turned the morning as bright as noon. Thunder followed immediately, so close and so loud that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Several of the raiders looked up in surprise, clearly unnerved by the sudden change in weather. But Olaf was already moving, his battle axe singing through the air as he charged down the slope toward the village. Behind him came his warriors, their own war cries joining his in a harmony that had been perfected over years of shared battles. The first raider to notice their approach barely had time to shout a warning before Olaf's axe took him in the chest, the blessed steel cutting through his foreign armor as if it were made of parchment. The man fell without a sound, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. The battle that followed was swift and decisive. Olaf moved through the raiders like a force of nature itself, his axe seeming to find its target with supernatural accuracy. His men fought with the fury of berserkers, but it was controlled fury, directed and purposeful. But as the fight raged, more raiders appeared from the other side of the village, reinforcements that Olaf hadn't counted on. Suddenly, instead of facing 20 men, they were outnumbered 2-1. Several of his warriors fell, and Olaf found himself being pushed back toward where the mother and child still huddled. It was then that he saw the leader of the raiders, a tall man with cruel eyes and a sword that gleamed with unnatural sharpness. This warrior was different from the others. There was something almost inhuman about the way he moved, the way his eyes seemed to reflect light like a cat's. "So," the leader called out in accented Norse, his voice carrying easily over the sounds of battle, "the famous Olaf Stormborn comes to play hero. I have heard tales of you, Viking. They say you speak with the gods themselves." Olaf didn't respond immediately, using the brief respite to position himself between the enemy leader and the cowering mother and child. His chest heaved with exertion, and he could feel warm blood trickling down his left arm where an enemy blade had found its mark. "Your gods cannot help you here," the leader continued, raising his strange sword so that it caught the dim morning light. "My master has given me power beyond your northern spirits. Your Thor is nothing compared to the forces I serve." At these blasphemous words, the thunder overhead redoubled its fury. Lightning began to strike more frequently, and Olaf felt the power building within him like a dam about to burst. But still, it wasn't enough. There were too many enemies, and his remaining men were growing tired. Behind him, he heard the woman's voice, now barely a whisper. "Please, save my child." The words seemed to echo not just in his ears, but in his very soul. Olaf closed his eyes for a moment and reached deeper than he had ever reached before, calling not just on Thor's strength, but on the god's very essence. "Thor!" he roared, his voice carrying across the fjord and echoing off the surrounding cliffs. "I offer my life, my soul, my very existence. Take what you will, but save this child. Let your thunder speak, let your lightning strike, let your hammer fall upon these enemies of the innocent." The sky responded to Olaf's prayer with a fury that had not been seen since the days of legend. Lightning began to fall, not in single bolts, but in a cascade of brilliance that turned the world white. Thunder crashed continuously, each peal seeming to shake the very bones of the earth. But it was what happened next that would be remembered in saga and song for generations to come. A figure began to materialize in the heart of the lightning storm. At first, just a shadow among the brilliant flashes, then growing more solid with each passing moment. He stood 9 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the sky itself. His red beard crackled with electric fire, and his eyes blazed with the fury of 1,000 storms. Thor himself had come to Midgard. The god's voice, when he spoke, was the sound of avalanches and hurricanes given form. "Who dares to threaten the innocent under my protection?" The foreign raiders, who had shown no fear in the face of Viking steel, now cowered like children before a raging parent. Several dropped their weapons and fled toward their ships, their courage utterly broken by the sight of an actual god walking among mortals. But their leader stood firm, raising his unnatural sword toward the divine figure. "I serve powers older than you, Thunder God, my master's authority." He never finished the sentence. Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, appeared in the god's hand and flew through the air with the speed of thought itself. It struck the enemy leader in the chest, and the man simply ceased. Not killed, not destroyed, simply gone, as if he had never existed at all. The remaining raiders who hadn't already fled looked at each other in terror, then threw down their weapons and ran. Within moments the village was empty, except for Thor, Olaf, his surviving warriors, and the woman with her child. Thor turned to face Olaf, and the Viking warrior felt himself trembling, not with fear, but with awe so profound that his mortal frame could barely contain it. The god's eyes, he realized, held the wisdom of ages and the fury of every storm that had ever raged. "You called upon me truly, Olaf Stormborn," Thor said, his voice now gentler but still carrying the rumble of distant thunder. "Your faith has been constant, your service faithful. What reward would you have of me?" Olaf looked back at the woman and child, then at his men who had fought so bravely. "I ask for nothing for myself, Lord Thor, but this woman has lost everything, her husband, her home, her village, and the child. He is innocent of any wrongdoing." Thor nodded approvingly and approached the mother and son. The woman looked up at the god with wonder rather than fear, somehow recognizing in his divine presence not a threat, but a protector. "What is your name, brave mother?" Thor asked, kneeling down so that his great height would not be so intimidating. "Astride," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying, "and my son is called Eric." Thor smiled, and when he did, the storm clouds overhead began to part, allowing golden sunlight to stream down upon the ruined village. He reached out with one massive hand and gently touched the child's forehead. "Little Eric," he said softly, "you have suffered much today, but you have also been marked by the gods. Your courage in staying silent while your mother prayed showed wisdom beyond your years." As Thor's finger touched the boy's skin, a strange transformation began to occur. Eric's eyes, which had been brown like his mother's, began to glow with a subtle inner light, not the harsh brightness of lightning, but the warm, steady glow of a hearth fire on a winter night. "My lord," Astride gasped, "what are you doing to my son?" "I am giving him a gift that will help him survive the trials to come," Thor replied. "The world is changing, little mother. Dark times approach, and those who would stand against the forces of chaos will need every advantage. Your son now carries within him a spark of divine fire. It will grow as he grows, and when he reaches manhood, he will be able to call upon powers that no mere mortal possesses." Olaf watched this exchange with growing understanding. He had called upon Thor to save the child, and the god had answered, but in a way that went far beyond simple rescue. Eric was no longer entirely mortal. He had become something new, something unique. "But there is more," Thor continued, turning back to face Olaf. "Your prayer was heard not just by me, but by my father Odin as well. The All-Father has been watching the affairs of men with growing concern. The raiders you fought today were not ordinary mortals. They served powers that seek to bring about Ragnarok before its appointed time." The god's expression grew grave, and the remaining storm clouds seemed to darken again in response to his mood. "These forces believe that by creating enough chaos and suffering in the mortal realm, they can weaken the barriers that separate the 9 worlds. If they succeed, the final battle will come not at the end of time, but now, while we gods are not yet prepared for it." Olaf felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What would you have us do, my lord?" "The child Eric must be trained and protected. In 15 years, when he reaches manhood, he will face a choice that could determine the fate of all the 9 worlds. He can embrace his divine heritage and become a guardian of the realm, or he can reject it and remain merely mortal." Thor stood and looked around at the ruined village, then raised Mjolnir high above his head. "But first, let us set this right." Lightning began to fall again, but this time it was different, controlled, purposeful. Each bolt struck a specific target, and where the lightning touched, miraculous transformations occurred. Burned houses were restored to wholeness, their timbers fresh and strong as if newly cut. Damaged fishing boats righted themselves, and their hulls sealed perfectly. Even the fishing nets reformed themselves, their tiers mending as if by invisible hands. Most miraculous of all, the bodies of the villagers who had been killed in the raid began to stir. One by one they sat up, looked around in confusion, and then joy as they realized they lived again. Astride's husband, the man whose body she had been kneeling beside, opened his eyes and spoke her name with wonder. "How?" Olaf began, but Thor raised a hand to silence him. "There are rules that govern even the gods," Thor explained. "I cannot simply undo death at will. To do so would upset the balance that maintains the 9 worlds. But these people died defending the innocent and their homes. Their deaths were noble, and in such cases exceptions can be made." As the reunited villagers began to celebrate their miraculous salvation, Thor placed a heavy hand on Olaf's shoulder. "You, my faithful servant, have earned a great reward. Name what you would have, and if it is within my power to grant, it shall be yours." Olaf considered carefully. He could ask for wealth, for fame, for a long life or an easy death. But as he looked around at the restored village, at the happy families reuniting, at little Eric, who now carried the spark of divinity within him, he knew what his answer had to be. "Grant me the wisdom and strength to help protect and train the boy," he said simply. "If dark times are coming, and if Eric will play a crucial role in them, then let me serve as his guardian and teacher until he comes of age." Thor smiled broadly, his pleasure evident. "Spoken like a true hero. Very well. I grant you extended life and enhanced strength. You will age slowly, remaining in your prime for as long as Eric has need of you. And more than that, I give you a portion of my own knowledge of warfare and strategy. When the time comes to train the boy, you will know how to prepare him for the trials he will face." As Thor spoke these words, Olaf felt a warm tingling spread through his entire body. His wounds healed instantly, the fatigue of battle disappeared, and his mind suddenly filled with knowledge he had never possessed before. Ancient techniques of combat, strategies employed in the wars between gods and giants, wisdom that had been accumulated over millennia. "And you, young Eric," Thor continued, turning back to the child who was now standing beside his restored father, "when the time comes for your training to begin, you will know it. The spark within you will guide you to the knowledge you need." The god began to fade as he spoke, becoming translucent as the storm clouds overhead dissipated entirely. "Remember, all of you, what happened here today must remain secret until the time is right. There are those who would seek to corrupt or destroy the child if they knew of his gifts too early." As Thor's form became less and less substantial, his voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The child is under my protection, but he must still walk the path of a mortal man until his time comes. Love him, teach him, guide him, but let him grow naturally. When he reaches his 18th year, then his true destiny will begin to unfold." With those words, the god vanished entirely, leaving only a faint scent of ozone and the memory of thunder in the air. The restored village buzzed with quiet conversation as the inhabitants tried to process what they had witnessed. Olaf noticed that while they remembered the attack and their rescue, their memories of seeing Thor himself seemed hazy, as if they recalled it as one might recall a particularly vivid dream. Only Olaf, Astride, her husband Gunnar, and little Eric retained crystal-clear memories of the god's appearance and words. This, Olaf realized, was another gift, allowing those who had specific roles to play to remember clearly while protecting the others from the burden of such weighty knowledge. Astride approached Olaf as he stood looking out over the peaceful fjord, her son's small hand clasped firmly in hers. The boy's eyes still held that subtle inner glow, but it was faint enough that someone would have to look closely to notice it. "The god said you would help protect and train Eric," she said, her voice steady despite everything they had been through. "What does that mean for us?" Olaf turned to face her, and she could see in his weathered features a new depth of purpose that hadn't been there before. "It means that I will stay near your family for as long as I am needed. My trading routes will bring me to this village regularly, and I will teach Eric the skills he will need, not just the arts of war, but wisdom, strategy, leadership." He knelt down to Eric's eye level, studying the boy's face with careful attention. The child showed no fear of the large Viking warrior, only curiosity and a surprising gravity for one so young. "Are you ready to learn, little one?" Olaf asked gently. Eric nodded solemnly. "The warm feeling in my chest tells me I should," he said, his voice clear and confident. "It's been telling me things since the thunder god touched me." Astride and Gunnar exchanged concerned glances, but Olaf nodded approvingly. "Good. That is the divine spark Thor placed within you. It will be your guide and your teacher, but you must learn to listen to it carefully. Sometimes it will whisper, and sometimes it will roar like thunder itself." Over the following weeks, as life in the village returned to normal and the events of that miraculous day began to take on the quality of legend, Olaf established himself as a regular visitor and unofficial protector. He arranged for a small house to be built on the hill overlooking the village, where he could stay during his increasingly frequent visits. Eric proved to be an exceptional student. Even at his young age, he displayed an intuitive understanding of strategy and tactics that amazed even Olaf. When they played simple war games with carved wooden pieces, Eric could see possibilities and connections that most adults would miss. "He learns as if he's remembering rather than discovering," Olaf confided to Gunnar one evening as they watched the boy practice with a wooden sword. "Thor's gift runs deeper than I initially understood." As the months passed, other changes became apparent. Eric's strength and coordination developed far more rapidly than normal for a child his age. His senses seemed sharper, his reflexes quicker. Most remarkably, he displayed an almost supernatural ability to predict changes in weather, often announcing incoming storms hours before any natural signs appeared. "The boy is truly blessed," Astride said one afternoon as she and Olaf watched Eric demonstrate a complex sword pattern that should have been beyond his physical capabilities. "But sometimes I worry about what all of this will mean for his future. Will he ever be able to have a normal life?" Olaf considered her question carefully before responding. "Define normal," he said eventually. "Is it normal to be born a thrall and die a thrall, never knowing anything but servitude? Is it normal to live in fear of raiders and wolves and harsh winters? Eric will face greater challenges than most, but he will also have greater power to meet those challenges." He paused, watching as Eric successfully completed a maneuver that had taken Olaf himself years to master. "Besides," he continued, "Thor said that when Eric reaches manhood, he will have a choice. The divine gifts can be embraced or rejected. If he chooses a normal life, the power will fade, and he can marry, raise children, and grow old like any other man. And if he chooses the other path," Olaf's expression grew somber, "then he becomes something more than mortal and takes up the responsibility of protecting the 9 worlds from the forces that would destroy them. It will be a harder path, but perhaps a more meaningful one." 15 years passed, like the changing of seasons, each one bringing new growth and development to the boy who had been touched by divinity. Eric grew tall and strong, his skills with blade and bow surpassing even seasoned warriors. The inner light in his eyes had grown brighter but more controlled, and he could now consciously call upon his enhanced abilities when needed. The village prospered under the protection of both Olaf's watchful presence and Eric's growing powers. Pirates and raiders who approached their shores found themselves turned back by sudden storms or inexplicably strong currents. Crops grew abundantly even in poor years, and the fishing was always good when Eric went out with the boats. But as Eric's 18th birthday approached, signs began to appear that the time of testing was drawing near. Strange ships had been sighted on distant horizons, vessels that seemed to be made of shadow and flame. Traders brought news of unnatural weather patterns across the northern seas, and several villagers had reported visits from mysterious figures who asked unsettling questions about children born during thunderstorms. On the morning of Eric's 18th birthday, he found Olaf standing on the cliff overlooking the fjord, his weathered face grave with concern. The Viking warrior had aged little in the 15 years since Thor's visit, but the weight of knowledge and responsibility had left its mark in the depths of his eyes. "It's time, isn't it?" Eric asked, coming to stand beside his mentor. Olaf nodded slowly. The enemies Thor warned us about have been growing in strength and boldness. They know about you now, though they don't yet understand exactly what you are. Soon they will come here in force, seeking either to corrupt you or to destroy you before your power fully manifests. Eric was quiet for a long moment, his enhanced senses picking up the subtle wrongness in the wind, a quality that spoke of distant storms and approaching darkness. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of one who had accepted a great burden. "Then I choose to embrace my heritage," he said simply. "I choose to become what Thor intended me to become." Odin, as the words left his lips, lightning began to dance around Eric's form, not the harsh, destructive lightning of natural storms, but the warm, protective lightning of divine power. His eyes blazed with inner fire, and when he raised his hand, Mjolnir itself appeared in his grasp, gleaming with the same blessed light that had marked it when Thor wielded it. "You are no longer entirely mortal," Olaf observed with satisfaction and pride. "You have become Thor's adopted son in truth, heir to his power and responsibility." Eric looked down at the village where his parents still lived, where the people who had raised him went about their daily lives in peaceful ignorance of the cosmic forces that swirled around them. His expression was filled with love and determination. "They will be safe," he said, and in those words was the promise of a god. "All of them will be safe. The forces of chaos will not find easy prey here." As if summoned by his declaration, dark shapes began to appear on the horizon, ships that moved against the wind and cast no reflection on the water. The final test was beginning, but Eric was ready for it. He had grown from a frightened child into a divine guardian, and the 9 worlds would be safer for it. Thunder rolled across the clear sky, and in its sound, those who listened carefully could hear the approval of Thor himself. The age of heroes was beginning anew, and at its heart stood a young man who had been saved by divine intervention and chose to use that salvation in service to others. The story had come full circle, but it was far from over. It was, in truth, just beginning. Thank you for joining us on this epic journey through the age of Vikings and gods. If you enjoyed this tale of divine intervention and heroic destiny, please leave a like and let us know what you thought in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more legendary stories from the ancient world, and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our global community of mythology enthusiasts.